Very good morning to you. So happy to see you this morning. One of the blessings I have is getting to look at this class and try in my feeble way to give you a few things of importance for us to live our life according to God's will, and I'm just very happy for this attendance this morning. I have a little article that I want to read that's a little out of touch with what we're studying, but I thought that some of you my age and older might really appreciate this. And you that are younger, let me just tell you up in advance, it actually happened what I'm getting ready to read. Actually happened. We sometimes hear folks talk about returning to the old ways of doing things. Then they tell about how they walked barefoot 3 miles to school in the winter with snow on the ground, and it was uphill both ways. I have absolutely no interest in a return to the old ways such as this. Many other old-time ways are just as well left in the past as far as I'm concerned. I remember that it was like what it was like when my grandparents had no electricity, no running water, and worst of all, no indoor toilet. Instead, they had a little house out behind the house with a half moon on the door. The Sears and Roebuck catalog was kept inside. And I have often wondered if Mr. Sears and Mr. Roebuck knew just how valuable their catalog really were to country folks. I remember helping my grandfather draw water from the well behind the house. He used a long metal sleeve which would open at the bottom to let the water in and then close when it was drawn out of the well. Occasionally, sometime, he would remind me of the wonderful aroma of coffee perking, ham frying, biscuits baking. All of my grandmother's wood-cooked stove is where it was cooked. Not only did this food smell good while it was cooking, the taste was unforgettable. Although these things are good to talk about and make for wonderful memories, few among us would want to return to the old way of life. We would all say that some changes are good. How do we recover from a spiritual drought that we're in at this time? How do we make sure our roots go deep and spread wide? Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Only by having a true and devoted love for the Word of God may we be rooted and grounded in the faith and be able to withstand the onslaught of evil in this world. I thought that was very apropos for this class, and I hope you got some remembrances out of it. I certainly did, because I can remember those days. Can't you? Some of you? Like I said, you that can't, it happened. It really happened. Possibly so. Possibly so. I'll take the way it is now. I want to read a portion that I had prepared about 3 weeks ago that I shared with you, and I want you to keep this in your memory. If you'd like to have a copy of it, I'll be glad to make it for you. It's some things that I think it's very pertinent to the study as we're looking in the book of Exodus, and we'll be in chapter 4, and we'll be at verse 18 this morning. I gave you some years of some individuals in the Bible that we're studying about and that we've talked about. And let me repeat those just for your refreshment this morning, if I can use that word. There was 4,000 years between Adam and the birth of Jesus. 4,000 years. Abraham to Joseph, who we talked quite a bit about both of these, there was 361 years between Abraham and Joseph. Abraham lived to be 175. Joseph died sort of young during that time at 110. The call to Moses. I thought this was very interesting since we're studying Moses. The call to Moses from the call to Abraham was 1,000 years in time. 1,000 years. When God approached Abraham, as we'll try our best to get to that portion this morning, with the call for him to take on the task of being the Father Abraham, there was 1,000 years between him and Moses. From the time Abraham entered Egypt to Moses leading the children out of Egypt was 430 years. And the last one, from Jesus Christ to Moses and his death, was 1,471 years. Now, why do I repeat this morning? I have said this statement in this class just about every session that we've had. Go from one verse to the next verse in the Bible. You go from one sentence to the next sentence in the Bible. It can contain a lot of time in between. That's what we need. Understanding the context in the Bible and the space and the time that it's being written and the time that it's being said and the purpose of it is so important. And I have benefited greatly from that during this study. But this morning, we want to look at more of Moses' task that God put upon him to eventually lead the children out of Egypt to the land of Canaan. We had, in verse 13 last week, we had talked about Moses giving another one of his difficulties, that he did not want to accept this command that God had commissioned him with. One thing that we want to keep in mind, Moses wrote this book that we're studying. Moses was the writer, but God was the author. And there's things as you read this and you think about, this is things that Moses is saying about himself, but it's things that God is telling him, this is what you've got to put in the words that we read. Moses has just told God that I am not eloquent. I can't speak well. Moses had just kept on. This was the fourth reason that Moses had given God for him not being up to this task. Not eloquent. Can't speak well. And we told you in here that Stephen, when he was speaking to the Jewish court, he had made the statement that Moses was an eloquent speaker. But that may have been a time that Stephen was referring to when Moses was in the court of Pharaoh in Egyptian living, when things were going 40 years of it. Things were going real well until he found out, when Moses found out in his heart that it's time to depart. But that could have been that time. And it could even have been even later after Moses had led the children out. But Stephen did make the statement that he was a better speaker than what we read about here, about him being eloquent. You know, another thing that I read that one writer said that really makes a lot of sense to us. You know, God does not expect, as we try to serve him, God does not expect eloquence. He doesn't expect eloquence. One thing that I made a statement in here that God is expecting more surrender from his children than he is anything else. And when we surrender ourselves, we are going to be able to do what he expects us to do. We're going to be able to touch our limits, hopefully, in running the race of however long we have to live here. Many times, I have been in a situation where I have seen professionals almost take over a congregation and cause elderships so much trouble, so much difficulty. because basically professionals can, if they are not completely guarded in their heart, they can let their standing in life enter into the church and cause influences on it that's not necessary. But let's look here at verse 18. After Moses just told God, I'm not eloquent, but God told him, I'm in the mouth-making business. I can take care of you. And he has told him that I can handle that. The main thing about it, and I asked you last Sunday morning, when you were in a circumstance in life somewhere back that, boy, you just thought, whatever somebody has asked me, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. Or somewhere you've been placed in a job that you're having to work beside someone. I can't handle this anymore. Trying circumstances. Isn't that something that even folks to a lesser degree we may be in? We may have trouble in the household. We may have trouble at work, in school. But we're not going to have the problem that Moses is confronted with here of leading 2 million people out of bondage with no training, only he was going to be able to do it because God told him, I will be with you. He tells us the same thing. Let's always remember that. Verse 18. So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see whether they are alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Let's touch on a little something here just for your knowledge. This word Jethro might just possibly be, instead of Moses' father-in-law, it could possibly just be his brother-in-law. In all possibility, from what many writers on the New Testament will tell you, that there was an individual named Reuel that possibly could have been Zipporah's father, and he's dead now. And Jethro has moved into the capacity, if he was a son, he is moving into the capacity of leading this clan living in Midian. Now that's just a possibility. You'll find that, though, from several writers, especially the writers of the church, that will tell you that is a possibility. But we're going to leave it here just like it is, where the translators tell us that this is Jethro. So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said, please let me go and return to my brother. Now, he's only got one brother. Let's keep that in mind. Only one physical brother. So who he's referring to here, he's wanting to go back and see those fellow kinsmen of his, those fellow Israelites that he left 40 years ago. 40 years ago. Now, did you notice? This is the words that we're getting after Moses has come down from Mount Sinai where God was talking to him. He's now gone back to Jethro and he's asked him to leave. So we see a little bit of positiveness here in Moses, that he's decided. Now, once again, for us today, how many of you been in a circumstance where it was something you didn't think you could do, and then you think about it, and you think about it, and you think about it, and you venture into it? Similarity to what Moses has showed us here. We're touching the basis. But we're still skeptical. Moses is still very skeptical. But he has took God's charge here on Mount Sinai, and he's gone and he's asked to leave. This was customary. This was something that was very, very customary during that time, that if you lived in a circumstance as Moses lived in there in Midian, tending sheep, but you just didn't leave. You had to go. It was, once again, I think customary is the best word to use. You needed to go and get permission to leave so that someone would be taking care of those flock of sheep that he was tending to. So, here we go. Verse 19. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, Go return to Egypt. All the men who sought your life are dead. Then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. So here, Moses is being encouraged once again by God in this circumstance. And Moses is preparing to take his family. How big a family? Well, we got a wife, Pharoah. We got two sons. Two sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Eliezer is the latest one that's been born. Some of the good commentators that I really like to read about will tell you here in this verse that some of the critics of Scripture will get on to this topic of one donkey. How would you take two children, two kids, and put them on one donkey? Well, then if you read the further explanation to this, in the Hebrews, when you see this word donkey, a lot of times that would refer to possibility of two. Plural here. Whichever. That's immaterial. But Moses is ready to take the family to Egypt here. Back to Egypt. Things are getting ready to get interesting now for Moses. He's been through this and he's debated himself and he's told God 4 times, I'm just not for this. But now we're into the process of actually making our way and our intentions of going back to Egypt. Now let's remember the distance here. You're looking at 300 miles from Midian back to Goshen. That's not going to be an overnight trip. The last part of that verse, number 20, very critical in this passage is to remember, and Moses took the rod of God. Moses even refers to his staff here as the rod of God. And that's exactly what it's going to be used for from here on. It's going to be the rod, it's going to be the staff that creates the miracles that leads the children, the 2 million children, men, women, and children, out of bondage. The rod of God that's going to have all of these circumstances that will take place in the miracles. Verse 21, and the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all of those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Now here I am. I'm getting ready to head back to Egypt. I've took the bait. God tells me what I need to do, even though I'm so leery of it. And now God tells me he's not going to let those people go. He's not going to let them go. But the thing Moses has got to remember, God has told him, I will be with you. All of those wonders and all of discouragement that Moses now has after he's heard these words from God is that Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. There are so many critical lessons, critical things to discuss as we have gone through these 2 chapters in the book of Exodus. I think this is one of the most important topics that Christians can study today is the hardening of the heart. I dare say there's not an individual in this class at this moment that is not concerned about somebody, either a family member, a friend, a co-worker, that just will not accept and understand why they need to be in church, right? Or why, let's go farther, or why they once was in church and now they've left their first love. I just heard a term about 6 weeks ago that was very, very interesting to me, called religious regeneration. Religious regeneration or reconstruction. You have any idea what that might pertain to? Brothers and sisters, what that is once our young people leave our homes, this is the reference that was given to me. Once our young people leave our home, and they're on their own. They're not there to go with mother and daddy on Sunday morning, and they don't expect to have to get up and go with mother and daddy. I can't tell them I'm going to stay here. I have to go. But when they leave home, they start questioning. And the more they question, the more they slip away from the work of the church. Religious reconstruction. That's happening. You know, we've talked about that here in the class, about the young generation, about how they're slipping away and how when they leave home, they forsake their first love. They stop going to church. They stop being a member of the New Testament church. Remember that. Religious reconstruction. Religious reconstruction. I want to read you an article. I think this is very good for the class because I think because I know with the question that I asked just a few moments ago, I know there are so many of us in here, if not all, that are worried about a certain individual that's close to us in some manner or other that has either never obeyed the gospel or has left the church and no longer there in apostasy. Listen to this. This is Brother Kaufman, who I hold as gives me more reference than anyone else. He says this: the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was due to his own stubbornness. Let me stop right there. You will find nowhere in the New Testament where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But we're going to understand that a little farther just in a moment. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart was due to his own stubbornness in refusing to yield to the warnings he received. Nevertheless, there is more involved here than some other ways of describing it. He will not leads inevitably to he cannot. The thing we've got to remember about Pharaoh here, he's getting earnings from all these Israelites that's working and building constructions. I heard last night listening to a lesson where they have found out now through archaeological discoveries. Archaeological discoveries. This is a thing that we don't hear a lot about, but some of you may read about this quite a bit. But archaeological discoveries confirm what the Bible teaches us and says to us. They found out that in one of the pyramids that was built, if we get further into the scriptures, we'll find out that Pharaoh eventually took the straw away from the Israelites, and they had no straw to build their bricks with, to put the bricks together with. They had to do it, they had to go get their own. If they wanted to have any to build these bricks, they had to gather it themselves, and he expected the same production. In one of the pyramids, they have found out through these discoveries, archaeologically, that halfway up, the pyramid was built with bricks with straw in them. And the rest of the way up, the pyramid was finished with bricks with no straw. Isn't that something? That just confirms what we're studying here in the book of Exodus, what Pharaoh's demands were. Stubborn and willful sin, listen, folks, stubborn and willful sin eventually leads to God's judgmental action against the sinner. Now, the word that you need to remember there is willful. Willful sin leads to God's actions. God hardens his heart. Such sinners are penalized. Talking to Pharaoh. Their senseless hearts are darkened. You can go to Romans chapter 1, verse 21 and get reference there on that. God gives less hearts. God hardens his heart. Such sinners are penalized. Their senseless hearts are darkened. Their senseless hearts are darkened. God gives them up. This is called what we refer to, Brother Kaufman says, is judicial hardening. Judicial hardening. We have often addressed this problem in many series that Brother Kaufman has. But I think this next part is where it really gets down to our understanding, or it helped me most. Listen to this. What actually happens in the life of the hardened? What actually happens in the life of the hardened? Does God cause them to sin? The answer must be no. God causes no man to sin. But there is a God-vested judgment that destroys that higher sensitivity in men's minds with which all are endowed. The destruction of that higher center of intelligence. The spiritual thymus is what he calls it. If we may call it that, is deadened, darkened, hardened, rendered ineffective. Rendered ineffective. Thus removing all restraint. Another result is that the hardened cannot either understand or appreciate spiritual truth. Cannot appreciate spiritual truth. Such persons may be great scholars, great intellectuals, holders of high office, and or possessors of great power, but the bloom, here, listen to this. He says, but the bloom has been plucked out of their brains by God himself. And such are doomed to walk in darkness. And his final sentence is this. Of these are the blind leaders of the blind. We're all going to come to an admittance that this is so true. The Bible, the New Testament, teaches on hardening of the heart to those that have just completely or never had the opportunity to know about the God of our salvation. One of the men that I listened to on this topic, he said this statement. He said, this is so dangerous. How would that be to one of us if all of a sudden we just decided church is no longer good for me? That's the reasoning a lot of individuals come to. The church is just not doing me no good. Well, you know, the old saying goes, is you get out of something what you put into it. You get out of something what you put into it. Pharaoh's hardened heart. You can go to chapter 7 in verse 13, and you'll find out there in the book of Exodus where Moses will say once again that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Pharaoh's heart was hardened because he wanted to be hardened. He was not going to let these people go. He was stubborn. It was too much of a gain for him for these people to leave their work. Verse 22. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord. That little passage right there, thus saith the Lord, is one of the first times that you find that in the Old Testament. And then it's repeated many, many times from here on. Thus saith the Lord. Israel is my firstborn, So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, firstborn. Why does Moses record here for us, through God's inspiration, that Israel is God's firstborn? Let's go back to where Abraham was talked to and told him the future that was going to be with Abraham in establishing the nation of Israel. This was God's beginning. This was God's creation. God wanted a nation that was going to serve him, as I said weeks ago, going to serve him and serve others as well. They was going to be rewarded for obedience, and they were going to be punished for disobedience. But he says, you tell Pharaoh. Now, we've not got to there. This is still the conversation that God is having with Moses after he has come down off the mount. After he has just told him that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. He won't let the children go. But let's remember the part that I hadn't said. He will not let the children go at first. God has just told us what he wants Moses to tell Pharaoh, that if he does not let the children go, I will require of him his firstborn. And that was down in the plagues on the very end that took place, that eventually allowed Pharaoh to determine to let the children go. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. I'm going to read this and then we're going to dismiss, but I want to make a statement about this before we leave. That Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet and said, surely you are a husband of blood to me. So let him go. Then she said, you are a husband of blood to me because of the circumcision. This is one part of this chapter that has got so many scholars, according to what I read, hard to really make a determination exactly why this is put in here the way it's put in this chapter. They are on their way to Egypt, and God is getting ready to take Moses' life. Now, let me leave you with this question, and we'll dismiss. After God had approached Moses at Mount Sinai through the burning bush, at the burning bush site, you're the man that I want to lead the children of Israel out of bondage. He's already took 4 excuses from him, and he still says, you're going. Then we get on our way, and God's ready to take his life. You see why this has really got people who have dug so deep in this scripture here. We'll study this next week, but here's what I want to ask of you. Between now and next Lord's Day, find you some good reading on this passage. This has nothing to do with the doctrine of the church, but it's there for a reason. It's there for our admonishment and our learning. So if you can, that would be so much help to all of us when we start here next Lord's Day morning. Thank you so much for your attention and your attendance today. Thank you.